Part 27. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 261. The corner of Baihu's mouth raised a bit of a wry smile, and his eyes were full of helplessness. It is indeed time to give you an explanation. This is my enemy here. I have now become your sole protecting beast. I am afraid that you will go back after finding something on the platform of reincarnation. The hatred of wife and son is irreconcilable. So I want to come to an end. Baihu's voice was unusually low and hoarse at the end, and the cold look in his eyes and between his eyebrows became more and more obvious. After Lin Yu heard Baihu say this, he felt quite sympathetic to Baihu. At this time, he turned his head and glanced at Baihu, and then sighed quietly. Well, I didn't know you had such a story. If that's the case, then okay, do you need me to do anything for you? Lin Yu turned around and stared directly at the white tiger. At this time, the white tiger just shook his huge tiger head, and then made a few slight noises. Growled. It's nothing, you just need to watch here carefully and don't do me any harm. After Lin Yu heard Baihu say this, 3 black lines appeared on his forehead, and he was speechless for a while. Okay, since you have said this, I won't say anything more. Come on, be careful. At this time, after Lin Yu finished speaking, he released the restraint on the white tiger. The white tiger glanced at Lin Yu, and then gently nodded the huge tiger's head. After a while, Lin Yu nourished the original white tiger. The soul power he gave himself was poured into Baihu. After Baihu sensed this, he turned his head and stared directly at Lin Yu, his eyes seemed to be somewhat grateful. Lin Yu just smiled, you have to come back soon anyway, so hurry up. At this moment, a huge figure suddenly appeared in the space in front of him. At this time, Lin Yu could only see that person's figure mixed with black mist, and this black mist was just like this, constantly rolling back and forth around it. After a while, the churning black mist seemed to boil away completely, and the surrounding world began to gradually give people an indescribable feeling of oppression. The pressure makes people feel like they can't breathe. Just a moment later, Lin Yu glanced at the 9 Heavens Netherworld beast, with a somewhat complicated meaning in his eyes. How is this possible? Alien beast, 9 Heavens Nether Beast Chaos Level 9, Level 50. Qualification, Alien, Top. Life, 999999999999999999999999999999999. Speed, 9999999999999999999. Defense, 9999999999999999999. Attack, 99999999999999999. Skill, unknown. At this time, Lin Yu finally understood that he could not see through these prehistoric level beasts because they were too powerful and unnatural, or it might be because there were many variables in them. The innate skills may not have been awakened yet, because they are the ancestors of all beasts, and it is possible to awaken any skill. When Lin Yu thought of this, he couldn't help but let out a long sigh, with a somewhat complicated meaning in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this time, the eyes of the 9 Heavens Netherworld beast were staring straight at the white tiger, with a faint smile on the corners of its mouth, and a mocking look in its eyes. It's interesting. It's really interesting. I really didn't expect that you would be so courageous. You actually dared to come over and cause trouble for me. Could it be that you are tired of eating this ambitious leopard? The eyes of the 9 Heavens Netherworld beast were staring at the white tiger, a bit of cold murderous intent flashed in its eyes, and the cold aura on its body was displayed without reservation. At this time, after Baihu felt the murderous intention on the 9 Heavens Netherworld beast, a bit of gloom flashed in his eyes, and the murderous intention on his body emerged so quietly. A vague smile appeared at the corner of Baihu's mouth, and a gloomy and cold look flashed in his eyes. It's ridiculous, it's simply ridiculous. Just because you want to threaten me, okay. Big courage. The white tiger's voice was not quiet. After hearing the white tiger's voice, the nine heavens netherworld beast also laughed like this. A hint of gloom flashed in his eyes, and finally his eyes stared straight at this person. Baihu, stupid guy, what's wrong with threatening you? What other objections do you have? At this time, after Baihu heard what the nine heavens netherworld beast said, a bit of gloom and coldness flashed in his eyes, and the bit of murderous intention in his body seemed to have condensed into substance, and it surged out like this. Stupid guy, I believe you will regret what you said today. Baihu's voice was unusually low and hoarse, and the coldness in his eyes became more and more obvious. After the nine heavens nether beast felt the cold aura from the white tiger, he half closed his eyes and stared at the white tiger. A gloomy murderous intent flashed in his eyes, and the cold aura was revealed. At this time, after the white tiger felt the vague aura, his face sank slightly, a strange color flashed in his eyes, and then a slight smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. You seem to be a little scared. Of course, the nine heavens nether beast would not admit this. At this time, he just turned his head and glanced at the white tiger coldly, and a murderous intent suddenly emerged from him. Asshole, damn it! After the nine heavens netherworld beast finished speaking, it suddenly pounced towards the white tiger. At this moment, it opened its bloody mouth and then rushed towards the white tiger. Its speed was extremely fast. It was in just one breath before it arrived in front of the white tiger. At this time, after seeing this scene, the white tiger's face was slightly condensed. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 262. Just in this momentary scene, the white tiger was fighting with the nine heavens netherworld beast. The two sides were fighting hard to separate, and it was hard to separate. You came and I went back and forth, without any courtesy. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu couldn't help but shook his head, feeling quite emotional in his heart. The fight this time was quite impressive, but why does the white tiger's movements seem so much slower than the nine heavens netherworld beast? What's going on? After seeing the scene again, the time and space beast couldn't help but shook his head slightly, and then a look of helplessness flashed in his eyes. And at this time, a cold aura slowly rose up from a distance. After the space-time beast felt that aura, his face was suddenly shocked, and his eyes were filled with a look of shock. An incredible look. A powerful force in the void rushed toward the white tiger inexplicably, and at this time, the body of the Juxiao netherworld beast was revealed. The Juxiao netherworld beast had a total of 9 huge heads. Each head is very ferocious. At this time, the white tiger just suddenly shook its extremely powerful tiger body, let out a roar, and then was completely blown away by the powerful force inside. Just between exhaling and inhaling, the white tiger suddenly and forcefully stabilized his figure. His eyes looked straight towards the Juxiao netherworld beast, with a hint of intrigue in his eyes. It has a somewhat strange color. You are quite capable, but so what? If I want to kill you, why do I need to go to so much trouble? The white tiger said in a cold and unhurried voice. When the queen of the nine heavens netherworld beast heard what the white tiger said, a sarcastic and mocking smile appeared on the corner of her mouth, and a flash of light flashed in her eyes. A look of contempt. Asshole, damn it! At this time, the white tiger suddenly opened its mouth, and then spit out a ball of flame. This ball of flame showed a milky white color, and this ball of flame seemed to cover the entire space in this area. It felt like it was completely burning. After seeing this, Juxiao netherworld beast's eyes flashed with a look of disbelief, and then he couldn't help but raise his eyebrows slightly. It's interesting. It's really interesting. It's such a pity. Although you have cultivated the Danyang fire, you are still going to die in today's situation. Juxiao Netherworld Beast just said in a cold voice unhurriedly. Behu heard Juxiao Netherworld Beast. After saying this, there was only a slight sarcastic smile on the corner of his mouth, and his eyes were full of mockery. Color. If you want to kill me, you have to see if you have the ability. I don't think you have the ability to really touch me. At this time, the white tiger suddenly moved forward, and pounced directly. The Nine Heavens Netherworld Beast swung itself directly, and its huge body rushed toward the white tiger, and it also pounced wildly. The two people were fighting each other like this, and it was hard to separate, In the end, the white tiger's wing was bitten by the Nine Heavens Netherworld Beast. The Nine Heavens Netherworld Beast used such sudden force to completely bite off one side of the white tiger's wing. At this time, Lin Yu, who was far away, saw this scene, and his heart suddenly sank. Oops, what should we do now? This guy is probably too scary. Lin Yu was quite excited, and at this moment the space-time beast heard it. After Lin Yu said this, a bitter smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and a lonely and helpless look flashed in his eyes. Oh, this matter seems to be very difficult to deal with now, it's a headache. After Lin Yu heard what the space-time beast said, he did the same thing at the time. He narrowed his eyes, with a somewhat complicated meaning in his eyes. After a while, he seemed to have figured out something, and the corners of his mouth looked like something. Bien suddenly evoked a faint smile. It seems like this keyboard just now should come in handy. After hearing what Lin Yu said, the space-time beast's eyes flashed with confusion. It looked at Lin Yu with a look full of confusion, and then shook its head. What do you mean by this? Do you plan to use this formation disk? What do you plan to use this formation disk for? The space-time beast's eyes were staring straight at Lin Yu, a special color flashed in his eyes, and there was a look of confusion between his brows. At this time, Lin Yu just turned his head and glanced towards the space-time beast. The corners of his mouth were slightly raised, with a slightly evil arc. The secret must not be revealed, but when the time comes, you will know that I want to do something. What's up? After the time and space beast heard what Lin Yu said, 3 black lines appeared on his forehead. Well, since you don't want to say anything, I won't ask any more questions. Lin Yu slowly took out the array plate. At this time, there was a bit of teasing in his eyes, and a faint smile flashed across the corner of his mouth. And just a moment later, the array plate instantly shone brightly. In just one breath, Lin Yu took the array plate and poured his power into it. A mysterious and obscure light flashed on the array plate. This light seemed quite indescribable to Lin Yu. At this time, a faint smile appeared on the corner of Lin Yu's mouth, and then he shook his head slightly. Interesting, it's really interesting. Then Lin Yu suddenly rushed out, as if he suddenly remembered something. He suddenly threw the yin-yang array plate into the void, and then a burst of thunder was triggered in the void, and the surrounding thunder was loud and the fire was soaring into the sky. After seeing this scene, the pupils of the 9 sky nether beasts suddenly enlarged, and his eyes were full of disbelief. He found it hard to believe that everything he saw in front of him was actually true. At this time, his brows were like twisted together. How is this possible? This is absolutely impossible. How could this little fellow's strength be so terrifying? This is simply unbelievable. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 263. At this time, Lin Yu poured his spiritual consciousness into it, and then the yin-yang array instantly flashed with a dazzling light. After a while, the light gradually began to solidify, and then the light began to gather in one place bit by bit. In the end, these lights flashed with a dazzling brilliance, giving people a mysterious feeling that was difficult to describe. After Lin Yu saw this scene, the smile at the corner of his mouth began to become more and more obvious. At this time, he couldn't help but shake his head slightly. Then several groups of light enveloped the Juxiao Netherworld Beast. The Juxiao Netherworld Beast didn't know why. Although he felt that this little guy posed no threat to him, when he saw these groups of light, his face instantly changed. This becomes ugly. In just a moment, the Juxiao Netherworld Beast let out an angry roar, and then, the Juxiao Netherworld Beast began to shake his body desperately. He twisted his body like this. It became an extremely weird posture. At this time, a special light flashed through the corners of Lin Yu's eyes and brows. He narrowed his eyes to a slit and chanted a mantra with his hands. This mysterious and obscure aura began to become more and more obvious. Immediately afterwards, Juxiao Netherworld Beast realized that this matter was unusual. The eyes of the Nine Heavens Netherworld Beast were staring at Lin Yu, a cold light flashed in its eyes, and the murderous intention on its body was even more faintly revealed. Asshole, damn it! At this time, Lin Yu just laughed like this. He just shook his head, with a bit of contempt flashing in his eyes. What can you do to me now? This is a dead-end situation. You won't be able to stay there for long before you turn into a ball of thick water, which can be regarded as revenge for the white tiger. Baihu looked at Lin Yu, his eyes full of gratitude. At this time, he hummed a few times, as if to express his gratitude to Lin Yu. Lin Yu just smiled and waved his hand. It doesn't have to be like this. To put it into detail, this guy is the one who is responsible for all of this. At this moment, Baihu heard Lin Yu. After saying this, the corners of his eyes and brows were filled with a sense of gratitude, and then he said no more. After a while, Lin Yu seemed to suddenly remember something. He chanted a few spells in his mouth again, and several lines of coiling dragons faintly appeared on the light pillar. After the Nine Heavens Netherworld Beast saw the coiled dragon pattern, its expression suddenly sank, a look of disbelief flashed in its eyes, and then it began to shake its head desperately. You can't do this, you can't do this, I tell you, you can't do this. At this time, the Nine Heavens Netherworld Beast was already quite hysterical, and the smile on the corner of Lin Yu's mouth began to become more obvious than before. And just after this moment, Lin Yu suddenly rushed forward. He waved his fist towards the Nine Heavens Netherworld Beast and suddenly hit it hard. The Nine Heavens Netherworld Beast was instantly smashed away by Lin Yu, and finally fell heavily to the ground. But in this brief moment, the Nine Heavens Netherworld Beast seemed to have been greatly insulted. His eyes were fixed on Lin Yu's body, and a killing intent came out of his body like this. Spread. You bastard, I want to kill you. I must kill you. If I don't eat your flesh alive and drink your blood, it will be difficult to eliminate the cruelty in my heart. After Lin Yu heard the Juxiao Netherworld Beast say this, 3 black lines appeared on his forehead, and he was speechless for a while. He rolled his eyes at the Juxiao Netherworld Beast angrily, and the corners of his mouth curled up even more. A bit of a sneer, just you? You can break this trap first and then we can talk. When the Nine Heavens Netherworld Beast heard what Lin Yu said, his eyes were full of contempt. What are you talking about? After hearing the voice of the Juxiao Netherworld Beast at this time, Lin Yu's expression darkened. He suddenly looked behind him and found that the Juxiao Netherworld Beast actually appeared behind him. The Nine Heavens Netherworld Beast opened its bloody mouth and bit Lin Yu directly. At this time, the white tiger suddenly rushed towards the Nine Heavens Netherworld Beast. After waiting for this moment, Lin Yu took a deep breath and finally calmed down his mood. At this moment, after seeing this scene, Lin Yu's eyes were full of a cold look, and the murderous intention in him quietly emerged at this moment. The murderous intent on the Nine Heavens Netherworld Beast was overwhelming. His eyes were staring straight at Lin Yu, a gloomy look flashed in his eyes, and a murderous intent floated quietly. After waiting for this moment, Lin Yu slowly took back the yin-yang array. After the nine heavens netherworld beast saw the yin-yang formation disc in Lin Yu's hand, a bit of greed clearly flashed through his eyes, and a hint of a smile appeared at the corner of his mouth, giving people a sense of awe. A creepy feeling. Lin Yu stared at the nine sky nether beast, and then smiled. I didn't expect you to be so capable, but what can I do? If I want to kill you, why would it be so troublesome? Lin Yu spoke slowly, and after hearing what Lin Yu said, the nine sky nether beast suddenly felt a surge of murderous intent. His eyes stared at Lin Yu, and his eyes were full of coldness. Asshole, I don't know who gave you the courage to talk to me like this. Today I can give you a chance to say it again. The corner of the nine sky nether beast's mouth curled up a sneer. At this time, Baihu realized that after so many years, not only his own strength was growing, but even the strength of the nine sky nether beast was also advancing by leaps and bounds. The white tiger stared at the nine sky nether beast, and there was a feeling between his eyebrows that was difficult to describe. At this moment, the nine heavens netherworld beast just snorted coldly, ridiculous guy, ridiculous and stupid. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 264. At this time, Baihu was furious when he heard what the nine heavens netherworld beast said. He suddenly rushed towards the nine heavens netherworld beast. His speed was extremely fast, with just one breath. As soon as he took a breath, he had already arrived in front of the nine heavens netherworld beast. At this time, the white tiger directly waved his claws towards the Juxiao netherworld beast, and smashed it suddenly. At this time, the corner of Juxiao netherworld beast's mouth was even more sneered, and his eyes were full of mockery. It's just a little trick. I really don't know who gave you the courage to do this. I don't know who gave you the courage to act like a fool. It's ridiculous to say it. At this moment, Baihu heard the Juxiao netherworld beast, and after saying this, there was a bit of gloom in his eyes. This clay bodhisattva still had a third of anger, not to mention that Baihu was also a divine beast, so at this time he spoke an angry roar. This is called the nether beast. After hearing the roar of the white tiger, it just shook its head, with a slight sneer on the corner of its mouth, and a kind of disdain in its eyes. What a stupid guy, it's so ridiculous. The white tiger suddenly rushed towards the Juxiao netherworld beast. His speed was extremely fast, and in just an instant, he had already arrived in front of the Juxiao netherworld beast. At this time, the nine heavens netherworld beast just swung its tail, and suddenly the white tiger flew out first. The white tiger fell heavily to the ground, spitting out a mouthful of blood. His eyes were full of a kind of with a look of reluctance. His eyes stared at the Juxiao netherworld beast. At this time in Juxiao netherworld, Lin Yu was looking at Lin Yu with his eyes. Lin Yu took a deep breath and calmed down his mood a little, and then he just looked at Lin Yu slightly. Shaked his head. It's ridiculous, it's really ridiculous. I've never seen such a ridiculous guy like you. At this time, when the nine heavens netherworld beast heard what Lin Yu said, there seemed to be a surge of anger in his body. He spoke to Lin Yu in an extremely hoarse voice. Asshole, what are you talking about? Now you can see the situation clearly. As long as I think about it, you will die here in an instant. So you still dare to talk to me like this? Do you really want to die? When Lin Yu heard the Juxiao netherworld beast say this, a bit of joking flashed through his eyes, and a mocking smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Interesting, it's really interesting. What are you capable of killing, me? Stop joking, you are not my opponent. If you don't believe it, let's compete. Juxiao netherworld beast has lived for so many years, and of course he is not a fool. At this moment, he saw Lin Yu's intention in the blink of an eye. At this time, he just shook his head and smiled. You don't need to deceive me like this. I'm not fool. Of course I can understand what your purpose is, so you'd better put away your little thoughts and be better to me. At this time, the Juxiao netherworld beast's eyes were staring straight at Lin Yu, with a bit of cold murderous intent flashing in its eyes, and the cold aura on its body also quietly emerged. Lin Yu just frowned slightly. He shook his head gently and smiled. Interesting, it's really interesting. Generally stupid people will say that they are not stupid. I think you are like that. People. Then do you know that angering someone who is stronger than you when you don't have enough strength is the real stupidity? The two people looked at each other, and the air between them seemed to be frozen. A moment later, Lin Yu laughed like this, with a burst of ridicule in his eyes. I really don't believe what you said. At this moment, a mysterious aura quietly rose up around them. After Lin Yu felt this aura, his face sank slightly, and something strange flashed in his eyes. Color. The smile at the corner of the Juxiao netherworld beast's mouth began to become more and more obvious. His eyes were staring at Lin Yu with a mocking expression between his eyebrows. Little guy, aren't you very powerful? Don't you think you are the best in the world? Come today and show me how powerful you are. At this moment, after Lin Yu heard what the Nine Heavens netherworld beast said, his face was filled with a gloomy look, and there was even more murderous intent in the corners of his eyes and brows. You don't deserve to see how powerful I am. If you don't even see what you are, how dare you play this trick in front of me? At this time, the Nine Heavens netherworld beast suddenly stepped forward, and then came in an instant. In front of Lin Yu, his eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and the eyes between his eyebrows were completely blank. It has a gloomy meaning. Seeing the two people scolding each other like this, the smile on the corner of Baihu's mouth started to become more and more obvious. Lin Yu rolled his eyes at Baihu angrily, with a smile in his eyes. Quite complicated. You are still in the mood to laugh here. At this moment, Lin Yu was almost furious with Baihu. After Baihu heard what Lin Yu said, he also shook his huge tiger head, with a somewhat strange look in his eyes. Why can't I laugh? Lin Yu took a deep breath and calmed down a little. Forget it, let's just forget about this for now, but I have something to tell you. After hearing what Lin Yu said, Baihu's eyes flashed with confusion, and then he raised his eyebrows slightly. What's the matter, just tell me. Baihu's eyes stared straight at Lin Yu, and Lin Yu's eyes were also quite complicated. At this time, Zhu Xiao Yuming saw that the two people did not take him seriously, and he was so angry that he roared, and then rushed towards Lin Yu. Baihu stood in front of Lin Yu. At this moment, Lin Yu didn't know what he said, but Baihu nodded his huge tiger head frequently. It was just a moment, and the two sides had a fight. Inseparable, the two sides fought together, and the surrounding space was also in turmoil. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 265. At this time, Lin Yu was opened wide by the Nine Heavens netherworld beast, which bit his shoulder. At this time, he made a muffled sound, and then the Nine Heavens netherworld beast swung the huge Lin Yu's head flew away. After a moment, Lin Yu climbed up with difficulty. When he wanted to step forward again, the space-time beast called him. Wait a minute, I have a way to deal with him. After Lin Yu heard what the space-time beast said, his expression was slightly condensed. There was a kind of confusion in the corners of his eyes and brows. He couldn't understand why the space-time beast said this at all. Are you sure? He is very strong. Are you sure you can really deal with him? At this time, the space-time beast had a meaningful smile on the corner of his mouth, and there was a hint of playfulness in his eyes. Of course I have a way, just take a look. At this moment, Lin Yu heard the time and space beast. After saying this, his face darkened slightly, and then he raised his eyebrows slightly. In his eyes, there was a kind of confusion between the eyebrows. Meaning. After waiting for this moment, the space-time beast suddenly stepped forward, and then in this breath, a violent force quietly radiated from the body of the space-time beast. That violent and domineering power spread back and forth in Lin Yu's chest. A moment later, Lin Yu flew backwards and fell heavily to the ground. A mouthful of blood spurted out from his mouth. There was a look of disbelief in his eyes and brows. "Asshole, damn it!" The Nine Heavens Netherworld beast slowly walked towards Lin Yu, and just like that, there was a sneer on the corner of its mouth, the murderous intent surged in its eyes, and that majestic and vast aura, just like this it seemed as if Lin Yu was about to be crushed. After a moment, Lin Yu's expression froze slightly, and then he felt the malice emanating from the Nine Heavens Netherworld beast. For some reason, Lin Yu suddenly felt that he might die today. Here. No, I can't die here, I can't die here. Lin Yu let out low roars one after another, which seemed to be shouting. At this moment, when the Juxiao Netherworld beast heard what Lin Yu said, there was only a slight sneer on the corner of his mouth. "It's ridiculous. I didn't expect you to be so stupid. If you just say that you can't die, won't I kill you?" And at this moment, the Nine Heavens Netherworld beast suddenly realized that the time and space around him seemed to be frozen. At this time, his face became pale and suddenly became ugly. How is it possible? The Juxiao Netherworld beast's expression darkened, and the space around him was suddenly frozen. The face of the space-time beast was full of joy. "Ha ha ha, great, simply great. No matter how arrogant you are, my power of time and space can still make you submissive." The smile at the corner of the space-time beast's mouth began to become more and more obvious. At this moment, the white tiger suddenly rushed toward the Nine Heavens Netherworld beast and bit it like crazy. He swallowed one head of the Nine Heavens Netherworld beast in one go, and swallowed 8 mouthfuls in succession. Until it was about to swallow the last head of the Nine Heavens Netherworld beast, the Nine Heavens Netherworld beast twisted its body desperately, and then suddenly broke away, and he directly threw the white tiger's tail away. At this time, Juxiao Netherworld's eyes were filled with a look of horror. In the corners of his eyes and between his brows, there was a gloomy and cold look. At this moment, he was filled with rage and murderous intent. This was shown without reservation. "I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill you. I'm going to skin you and drink your blood. Otherwise, it would be difficult to eliminate the hatred in my heart." The Nine Heavens Netherworld beast shouted like this, and the murderous intent in its eyes began to become more and more obvious. After Lin Yu saw the scene at this moment, he didn't take it too seriously. The corner of his mouth just evoked a faint smile, and then he shook his head slightly. His eyes, there was a burst of contempt in it. "You think it's just you and you want to kill me? Isn't that just an idiot's dream? Ha ha ha." Lin Yu spoke unhurriedly, with a look of contempt in his eyes. The Nine Heavens Netherworld beast had never been looked down upon by others so much, so at this time, the Nine Heavens Netherworld beast stared at Lin Yu coldly. "Don't think that you can definitely defeat me now by biting off 8 of my heads. Even if you can bite off 8 of my heads, you may not be my opponent now." The eyes of the Nine Heavens Netherworld beast were full of a cold look, and the corners of its eyes and brows were full of a cold meaning. At this moment, after Lin Yu saw this scene, a faint smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and then he shook his head. "This strength is for looking at, not talking about." At this time, I saw an angry roar coming from the mouth of the Juxiao Netherworld beast, and the killing intent on his body began to become more and more obvious. At this time, the killing intent around his body seemed to be it's condensed into substance. Lin Yu suddenly stepped forward. In just one breath, he had already arrived in front of the Nine Heavens Netherworld beast. The two sides faced off like this for a while. After a while, the Nine Heavens Netherworld beast was bitten by the white tiger. The 9 fallen heads actually returned to their original appearance in such an instant. Even after Baihu saw this scene, a bit of disbelief flashed in his eyes. Baihu's eyes were staring straight at the Nine Heavens Netherworld beast. At this moment, he also took a deep breath. Can be regarded as barely calming down his mood at this moment. Did you really master that move? The white tiger's eyes were fixed on Juxiao Netherworld Beast, and at this time, Juxiao Netherworld Beast just smiled slightly, with a look of complacency in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. Of course, otherwise, why do you think I am so confident that I can deal with you? You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Sheng Chong. Chapter 266. At this moment, the Nine Heavens Netherworld Beast may be too proud, but it is not in a hurry to take action. It just says to itself, my move is called Tais Hang Suanji. Of course, if you don't understand, if so, then this move has another name, rebirth from the ashes. The Nine Heavens Netherworld Beast was so proud of this move, his eyes were staring directly at Lin Yu, with a rather greedy look on his face. If I guessed correctly just now, the guy who fixed me should be a time and space beast. It is quite rare for a beast that can understand time and space. The Nine Heavens Netherworld Beast spoke unhurriedly like this, with a few meaningful smiles on the corners of its mouth. At this moment, Lin Yu heard the time and space beast say this, and the corners of his eyes and eyebrows were completely knotted with a kind of coldness. What do you want to say? Now don't hold back. Say everything you want to say. It doesn't matter. At this moment, Lin Yu was talking coldly and unhurriedly. After hearing what Lin Yu said, the Nine Heavens Netherworld Beast also burst out laughing. His eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and a cold murderous intent quietly emerged. It's very simple. If you want to live, you'd better hand over the space-time beast in your hand obediently now. If you hand over the space-time beast, I might be able to spare your life, but if you dare not pay, then next year's day will be your death anniversary. The Nine Heavens Netherworld Beast said in a cold voice. After Lin Yu heard the Juxiao Netherworld Beast say this, a bit of gloom flashed in his eyes. His eyes stared straight at the Juxiao Netherworld Beast, and the corners of his mouth curled up. A bit of a sneer. You said you're so ugly, why did you think of being so beautiful? Do you think I might agree to it? It's just nonsense, it's so ridiculous. And at this moment, after hearing what Lin Yu said, the Nine Heavens Netherworld Beast suddenly moved towards Lin Yu very quickly, and a ball of black energy quietly formed around him. That mass of black energy gave people an extremely indescribable feeling. At this time, after Lin Yu saw the black energy, his face sank slightly, and a look of surprise flashed between his eyes and brows. It's strange, why does this guy give people such an evil feeling? What is going on? The feeling on this guy is too strange. After Baihu heard what Lin Yu said, a bitter smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and his eyes were full of helplessness. Who knows what is going on with this guy? Not only are you strange now, but I am also strange. It's very strange that he hasn't come here for such a long time, and he is really not what he was back then. At this time, after Lin Yu heard Baihu say this, his eyes narrowed to a slit, and a bit of gloom flashed in his eyes. It seems that the only way to use that move is. After Baihu heard what Lin Yu said, a bit of excitement suddenly flashed in his eyes. At this time, Baihu turned his head and stared directly at Lin Yu with a bit of playfulness in his eyes. Which move is that? You should tell me about it. After Lin Yu heard what Baihu said, he immediately began to communicate with the space-time beast. How about the soul cone condensed with Baihu's soul power now? After hearing what Lin Yu said, the space-time beast's eyes flashed with a special color, and then he raised his eyebrows slightly. With the current white tiger's soul power, if it really condenses into the soul, if it's a cone, its power is beyond our expectation. At this moment, Lin Yu heard the time and space beast. After saying this, some complex colors appeared in his eyes, and the smile at the corner of his mouth began to become more and more obvious. If that's the case, that's fine. Today I want to see what kind of abilities this guy is capable of. Lin Yu's expression condensed, and then he started to make hand gestures and recite a mantra directly. At this time, he heard him saying quietly, "The sky and the earth are black and yellow, to prove that there is no panic. From the beginning of the world, there is nothing better than unity, and everything is the same. You can see that when you can come back." At this time, when Lin Yu finished speaking, a mysterious and obscure aura from his body was suddenly released, and then followed by a mysterious aura, which gave people the feeling that he was about to collapse. Bad feeling. A somewhat ominous premonition suddenly emerged in the heart of the Nine Heavens Netherworld beast. At this time, his eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and then he couldn't help but frown slightly. What the hell does this damn guy want? The Nine Heavens Netherworld beast took a deep breath and calmed down his mood a little. At this moment, he rushed towards Lin Yu with undiminished power. Lin Yu just turned slightly to the side to avoid the collision of the Juxiao Netherworld beast, and then turned back and punched the Juxiao Netherworld beast directly in the lower abdomen with such a heavy punch. Superior. This Nine Heavens Netherworld beast only lasted for a moment, and was blown away by Lin Yu's punch. The eyes of Juxiao Netherworld beast at this moment were full of disbelief. Although Juxiao Netherworld beast knew that this rain might have a trump card, it did not expect that Lin Yu's power could reach such an extent. At this time, the eyes of the Nine Sky Nether beast were fixed on Lin Yu, and Lin Yu was also staring at the Nine Sky Nether beast with a smile on his face. After a moment, the Nine Sky Nether beast felt as if it was pierced by a needle in its head, and the pain was a pain that hit its soul directly. The eyes of the Nine Sky Nether beast were full of disbelief. He didn't dare to believe that Lin Yu could actually attack his soul directly, and the soul was the most vulnerable part of the Nine Sky Nether beast. Even after so many years, it still hadn't cultivated any results. The Nine Sky Nether beast let out a painful roar, and then its body twisted back and forth, its face gradually became ferocious, and its eyes and eyebrows were full of an indescribable brilliance. After waiting for this moment, Lin Yu looked at the Nine Sky Nether beast with a smile on his face. At this time, the white tiger condensed into an extremely huge tiger head directly in the void. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 267. The huge tiger head suddenly moved toward the Nine Heavens Netherworld beast and bit it directly. In just one breath, the Nine Heavens Netherworld beast was completely swallowed by the tiger head. The Nine Heavens Netherworld beast just fell. After seeing this scene, Baihu's eyes flashed with disbelief. This guy actually died like this? In this case, it would be a little too easy. Alas, it is really hard to explain in words, it is hard to say in words. The white tiger just shook its huge tiger head. At this time, Lin Yu heard it. After Baihu said this, 3 black lines appeared on his forehead. He was speechless for a while. He rolled his eyes at Baihu angrily. If you didn't want him to die, you should have saved his life just now. In that case, you might still be able to play with him. When Baihu heard what Lin Yu said, he quickly shook his head, and a special color flashed in his eyes. Forget it, this guy is very difficult to deal with. At this moment, after Lin Yu heard what Baihu said, he couldn't help but laugh. Okay, now that your things are done, isn't it time to take care of mine? Lin Yu's eyes stared straight at Baihu, with a special color in his eyes. After Baihu heard what Lin Yu said, the smile on his face turned out to be like this at this moment, as if it had frozen. He turned his head and stared directly at Lin Yu. Are you really going to do this? Let me remind you, this matter will be very difficult. Once you get to the stage of reincarnation and you want to withdraw, it will be too late. After Lin Yu heard Baihu say this, a bit of confusion flashed in his eyes. At this time, he was staring directly at Baihu. What do you mean? Why can't I understand you? At this time, when Baihu heard Lin Yu say this, A faint smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. I don't know who told you this news, but what I want to say is to tell you this news. Those people must have no good intentions. When Lin Yu heard Bai Hu say this, he felt a little vigilant in his heart. If he were an ordinary person, Lin Yu might really be a little suspicious if he told him this, but after all, it was him. Lin Yu didn't believe this thing he told himself. Come and tell me, what do you mean by this? At this time, when Bai Hu heard what Lin Yu said, a smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. I knew you would ask this, so let's put it this way, although I don't know who told you, but I can tell me something. Say it. The matter of reincarnation, the beginning of eternity, parting at the end of the world, unfettered Taoism, disaster for eternity, among thousands of sects, destruction at the end of the world, keep it secret as before. After Lin Yu heard Bai Hu say this, his eyes were full of confusion. At this time, he was staring straight at Bai Hu, with a hint of confusion in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. It's quite obvious. Strange, what do you mean by this? Why am I not sure? Literally, the reincarnation is now in a time of chaos. If you go to the stage of reincarnation now, there will probably be only one end. What will happen? You should come and talk to me. Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on Bai Hu's body, and at this moment, Bai Hu softly uttered 4 words from his mouth: eternal fall into reincarnation. When Lin Yu heard the words eternal reincarnation, a bit of surprise flashed in his eyes. At this time, his eyes were fixed on Bai Hu's body, and the corners of his eyes and brows were, which is a complete confusion. Eternal fall into reincarnation, I have never heard of this before. At this time, Bai Hu heard Lin Yu. After saying this, the corner of his mouth evoked a vague smile, and a bit of complexity flashed in his eyes. Have you never heard of it? It means that this kind of thing will not happen, this kind of thing will happen, and it will be very troublesome. Lin Yu frowned slightly, a special color flashed in his eyes, and a wry smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Then what should we do now? Lin Yu's eyes were staring straight at Bai Hu. Bai Hu glanced at Lin Yu. Do you have to go? At this time, Lin Yu nodded gently. Yes, you must go. Bai Hu saw that Lin Yu's eyes were so determined. At this moment, some complicated emotions emerged in his heart. Well, if we must go, then there is only one way that may work. At this time, when Lin Yu heard what Bai Hu said, a special color appeared in his eyes. What can I do? The art of fixing the soul. You must master the art of fixing the soul, so that you can ensure that you will not get lost in this reincarnation. At this time, Arya also said softly in Lin Yu's sea of consciousness, what he said is indeed right. You must learn the art of soul concentration to ensure that you are awake in this reincarnation. That's the only way it's possible. Lin Yu heard this. After Arya said this, a special color flashed in her eyes. Although Lin Yu was quite skeptical of Bai Hu's words before, he did not believe that Arya would deceive him. If that's the case, why didn't you tell me in advance? Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on Arya, and at this time, Arya's mouth corners were raised with a bitter smile. That was because there was no chance at the beginning. No chance? What do you mean? The you before that were very powerful. In front of him, I felt like I was being spied on at any time. That's why I didn't dare to say anything more. At this moment, after hearing what Arya said, Lin Yu couldn't help but half closed his eyes, and his eyes were raised with a bit of complexity. So that's it, so that's it? Arya's mouth corners were raised with a helpless bitter smile. I don't know that the you before was clearly you, but if you really do what he said, then for you, there will probably be only disadvantages and no benefits. But why would he harm you? Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 268. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Arya said, some complicated meaning flashed in his eyes. At this time, he couldn't help but raised his eyebrows slightly, and there seemed to be a flash in his eyes. It has a somewhat special color. There are some things that I don't know how to tell you now, but it's still a bit complicated anyway. At this time, after hearing Lin Yu say this, Arya's eyes flashed with a complicated light, and then she shook her head and smiled. I always feel like there is something wrong. When Lin Yu heard what Arya said, he raised his eyebrows slightly, and then stared straight at Arya. He didn't know why he always felt that Arya might know at this time. It was like something. At this time, Lin Yu's lips evoked a bit of a teasing smile. Do you know something? Lin Yu's eyes were staring straight at Arya. At this time, Arya was so slightly stunned at first, but after a moment, she nodded slightly. I do know something, but there are some things I don't know how to tell you. At this moment, after hearing what Arya said, Lin Yu's eyes evoked a special light. How do you say this? At this moment, Lin Yu's eyes were staring straight at Arya. There was a somewhat meaningful smile on the corner of Arya's mouth. Have you ever thought about what if he is not you? After hearing what Arya said, Lin Yu seemed to suddenly understand something. At this time, he couldn't help but shake his head slightly. No, it will never be like this, it will never be like this, you are wrong, he will never be like this. At this time, Arya smiled instead, her eyes staring directly at Lin Yu. Are you really so sure? Lin Yu was stunned for a moment, and then he took a long breath. Oh, maybe. Arya had never seen Lin Yu's face look so determined, so she was as clueless as a 2-foot-tall monk and couldn't figure out what was going on. What's going on? It seems a little strange. Your face looks a little unusual. Lin Yu just looked at Arya, and at this moment Arya just waved her hands and smiled, but didn't say anything more. If you can be so convinced, that would be the best. I'm afraid you don't believe it yourself. At this time, Lin Yu heard what Arya said, and his eyes were quite confused. His eyes were fixed on Arya, and then he smiled. That feeling is unmistakable. There is absolutely no misunderstanding between two people, so I firmly believe that that person is me. Maybe someone has lied to him, but he will never lie to me. At this time, Lin Yu's eyes were full of determination. After Arya heard Lin Yu say this, she suddenly covered her face and let out a giggle. Interesting, you are really interesting. At this moment, Lin Yu also nodded slightly, of course. At this time, the group of people came to the Sea of Biming. Only after they came to the Sea of Biming did Lin Yu finally understand why they said this to him at the beginning. At this time, there were countless wronged souls in the Sea of the North Underworld. When they came here, the surrounding sea water was churning like this. It was like it was completely boiling. The mountains, rivers, vegetation, and rocks began to slowly move towards the sea. They come together like this. Those mountains and rivers just quietly appeared in one place, and then the cold momentum gave people a mysterious feeling. That feeling was quite confusing. At this time, Baihu turned his head and glanced at Lin Yu, with a bitter smile on his lips. What to do now depends entirely on what you want. After Lin Yu heard what Baihu said, there was a bit of a wry smile on the corner of his mouth, and a bit of disbelief flashed in the corners of his eyes and brows. Trouble, it is indeed a bit troublesome, it gives me a headache and a bit, I have a headache. It's better to learn the art of fixing the soul first, but how should we practice this art of fixing the soul? Lin Yu just turned his head, staring straight at Baihu. After Baihu heard what Lin Yu said, he also smiled like this, with a bit of teasing and amusement in his eyes. This soul-fixing technique is actually difficult to say and simple to say, but the secret book of this practice may be difficult to find now. 3 black lines appeared on Lin Yu's forehead. At this moment, Arya's voice sounded in Lin Yu's mind. Borrow the entire book of the art of soul fixation for 3 days at a special price of 300,000 points. Lin Yu looked at the few points he had left, and he could barely get by with 300,000 points. At this time, Lin Yu's eyes were staring straight at Arya, with a special color flashing in his eyes. I'm very suspicious of something now. At this time, Arya turned her head and smiled towards Lin Yu. I wonder what you suspect. I wonder if you are the roundworm in my stomach. How come you know everything? At this moment, Arya also smiled like this, with a somewhat complicated meaning in the corners of her eyes and brows. Because we think what the master thinks and what the male master thinks is difficult. This is our principle. Lin Yu obviously didn't believe the nonsense Arya said, but he didn't say anything more. What does borrowing for 3 days mean? Lin Yu's eyes were staring straight at Arya, with some complicated meanings flashing in his eyes, and at this moment Arya just smiled. It's very simple, just borrow it for 3 days. If you can fully understand it within these 3 days, then it is equivalent to possessing the art of fixing the soul. If not, then I can only say sorry to you. 3 black lines appeared on Lin Yu's forehead, and he was speechless for a while, but after a moment, he nodded slightly. If that's the case, fine, I'll borrow it for 3 days. I want to see what this soul-fixing technique is. Baihu looked at Lin Yu frozen on the spot and shook his head slightly. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 269. Hey, this soul-fixing technique is so easy to find. I'm afraid this little guy will be in a bit of trouble this time. At this moment, when Lin Yu came to his senses, he turned around and glanced at Baihu. I'm afraid I'm going to have to work hard for you in the past few days to protect me. After Baihu heard what Lin Yu said, his eyes were quite complicated, but a moment later, when he thought about it, his expression suddenly changed to one of surprise. What? What did you say? You said you found the soul-fixing technique. Baihu's eyes were staring straight at Lin Yu. At this moment, Lin Yu's mouth had a slight smile, and then he nodded slightly. Yes, I have indeed found the soul-fixing technique. At this time, Baihu's face was also shocked, and his eyes were full of disbelief. How is this possible? This soul-fixing technique has been lost now, but a little guy like you can actually find it. This is simply unbelievable. Lin Yu rolled his eyes at Baihu angrily. Stop talking nonsense. These days I have to concentrate on studying the art of fixing the soul, so I need you to protect me. This should be no problem. Baihu was slightly startled at first, but after a moment he nodded gently. Of course it's no problem. There was a faint smile on the corner of Baihu's mouth. For some reason, Lin Yu always felt that Baihu had some other purpose. He turned his head and glanced at Baihu. What do you want to do? Baihu was also stunned at first, but after a moment he waved his hand and shook his head. I can do anything I want to do, but I don't want to do anything. Lin Yu's eyes were staring straight at Baihu, and there was a slight smile on the corner of his mouth. Are you telling the truth? There was quite a bit of determination in Baihu's eyes. It's absolutely true. Even so, Lin Yu still felt that this white tiger seemed a bit abnormal, but at this moment, he didn't say anything more and just smiled. Just after this moment, Baihu seemed to have remembered something. He turned his head and glanced at Lin Yu, with a meaningful smile on his lips. Little guy, no matter what, I still have to tell you something. After Lin Yu heard Baihu say this, he turned his head and glanced at Baihu, with a strange color flashing in his eyes. What happened? This soul-fixing technique is extremely difficult to learn. If you really think you can't master it, don't force it, because if you try to steal it, I'm afraid. When Lin Yu heard Baihu say this, he stopped talking. At this time, Lin Yu also nodded slightly and smiled. Okay, don't worry, I won't. You might do something that you know is impossible, so you don't have to worry about me. Baihu opened his mouth, as if he wanted to say something more, but he stopped talking. He just nodded and smiled softly. Okay, then I wish you good luck. Lin Yu nodded gently, and then immediately sat cross-legged, looking at his nose and nose, entering into a state of concentration. At this moment, Bai Hu's eyes were staring straight at Lin Yu, with a hint of solemnity flashing between his eyes and brows. After a while, Lin Yu began to slowly look through the book on the art of fixing the soul, with a somewhat complicated look in his eyes. This soul-fixing technique is not difficult to practice. After reading it for a while, Lin Yu became calm and focused, and entered a state of concentration with his eyes filled with concern. At this moment, he felt all external objects, they are all hidden in the heart, and everything is hidden in the form. After a moment, Lin Yu suddenly opened his eyes, and then he waved his hands so lightly that a sharp breath spread out from his palm, followed by a mouthful of blood. He actually spurted it out from his mouth like this. On the first day, Lin Yu didn't know what to do and refused to enter. On the second day, Lin Yu had a slight understanding of it, but his understanding was still insufficient. On the third day, Lin Yu's cold aura spread like this, and then he suddenly opened his eyes. At this moment, the white tiger's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, so when Lin Yu suddenly woke up, the white tiger was so frightened that he almost jumped up. Lin Yu turned around and glanced at Bai Hu, with a faint smile on his lips. At this time, Bai Hu rolled his eyes at Lin Yu angrily. How is it? How is your practice of fixating the soul now? At this moment, Bai Hu's eyes were staring straight at Lin Yu, with a hint of expectation in his eyes. At this time, when Lin Yu heard Bai Hu say this, he couldn't help but smile. It's quite a bit of a joke. At this moment, when Bai Hu saw Lin Yu's expression, his expression changed and he suddenly became happy. What? It seems that the result is good this time, right? At this moment, Lin Yu just shook his head slightly. I don't know how to do it. This soul-fixing technique is too profound. Bai Hu rolled his eyes at Lin Yu unhappily, and a strange look flashed in his eyes. Since it doesn't know how to do it, why are you so happy? At this moment, Lin Yu suddenly laughed. He turned his head and stared at Bai Hu, and then he said slowly, of course, it's because, although I don't know how to do this soul-fixing technique, I have other skills to learn. At this moment, Bai Hu heard Lin Yu, and after saying this, a little excitement flashed in his eyes. At this time, his eyes were staring at Lin Yu. So what did you succeed in practicing? A brand new soul skill, but it's not complete yet. Everything depends on my own research and thinking. However, if I practice it to perfection, all reincarnations will not be affected by it. The yin and yang of heaven and earth can all be created by nature. The beginning of all things is the beginning of yin and yang. Survival of the beasts, awakening the beast taming system at the beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 270. At this moment, after Bai Hu heard Lin Yu say this, his eyes were full of confusion. He couldn't understand what kind of medicine was sold in Lin Yu's gourd, so at this moment he glanced at Lin Yu so unhappily. I have absolutely no idea what you mean by that. Lin Yu just waved his hand gently and smiled. If you don't understand, forget it. But at this moment, when Bai Hu heard what Lin Yu said, he felt a little unwilling. I forgot to tell you before you enter concentration. Even if you can't learn the soul concentration method, you still have to practice the soul concentration technique. If your soul is unstable this time, then you may enter the stage of reincarnation and die without rebirth. At this time, after Lin Yu heard Bai Hu say this, his eyes and brows were full of disbelief. At this time, he was staring straight at Bai Hu. Are you telling the truth? Bai Hu rolled his eyes at Lin Yu angrily. Do you think I still need to lie to you now? You wouldn't. After Bai Hu said this, he suddenly paused. His eyes were staring straight at Lin Yu, with a strange color flashing between his eyes and eyebrows. At this time, Lin Yu also had a wry smile on his lips, and then nodded slightly. It's true that he doesn't know how to fix the soul, but there are some things that are true. Lin Yu said quietly like this. After Bai Hu heard what Lin Yu said, he was very anxious in his heart. He turned his head and glanced at Lin Yu, with a somewhat complicated meaning flashing in his eyes. What's going on? Please tell me faster. At this time, Lin Yu seemed to feel that Bai Hu was a bit immoral by teasing him all the time, so at this time, he just shook his head and smiled. Actually, although I have not learned this soul-fixing technique, my current soul-fixing method is called Fulongju. How do I call it Fulongju? I can mix the creation of yin and yang and read the vitality of the world. I can also make myself the soul is immortal. At this time, Lin Yu was talking unhurriedly. After Bai Hu heard what Lin Yu said, his eyes were full of disbelief. His eyes were staring at Lin Yu, and then he raised his eyebrows slightly. Are you telling the truth? At this time, Lin Yu had a meaningful smile on his lips, and then nodded slightly. That's natural. Do you think I need to lie to you? Bai Hu nodded slightly, turned to look at Lin Yu, and his eyes were a little more complicated. Yes, it's really great. Lin Yu just smiled like this. Thank you for the compliment. But even so, what can you do? Although you are powerful, the danger in the sea of Northern Ming Dynasty may kill you at any time. Are you sure you must take the risk? Lin Yu did not answer, but suddenly took a step forward. At this moment, Bai Hu immediately understood what Lin Yu meant, and then nodded slightly. Okay, I understand what you mean. I wish you good luck. At this time, Bai Hu just had a thought, and then entered Lin Yu's sea of consciousness in the next second. At this moment, Lin Yu saw the previous scene. The sea water was churning and the sky was dark. At this moment, everything seemed to have lost its original brilliance. Up and down, everything between heaven and earth had lost its original light. When Lin Yu stepped into it, he only felt a strong sense of oppression, squeezing him desperately, making him quite breathless. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu's eyes and brows were full of panic. At this moment, he finally understood why both Arya and White Tiger were so afraid of this place. At this time, Lin Yu also had a wry smile on his lips, and his eyes were full of helplessness. He just sighed heavily, and then shook his head. There is nothing we can do, there is nothing we can do, how can it be like this? At this time, Lin Yu said coldly. At this time, Arya heard Lin Yu. After saying this, a bitter smile appeared on the corner of her mouth. Master, I have detected the weather here, the intensity of spiritual power, and the power of all aspects of heaven and earth elements. The outside world is very different, and there seems to be a very special element here. When Lin Yu heard what Arya said, something flashed in his eyes. It was unbelievable that at this time, he turned his head and glanced towards Arya, and then he also frowned slightly. What do you mean? What is that special element? After Arya heard Lin Yu say this, a bitter smile appeared on the corner of her mouth, and a look of helplessness flashed in her eyes. It is an extremely special dark attribute element. This kind of dark attribute element does not exist at all in the plane of time and space before you. It is even rare in this space. Perhaps it is only found in this place. Exist. At this moment, Lin Yu's eyes flashed with some complexity, and a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. How powerful is this dark attribute element? Let's put it this way. If you get close, I'm afraid it can even devour you. Originally, Lin Yu wanted to see how powerful this dark element was, but Arya's words directly gave him up. In that case, then okay, but where is this samsara platform, Arya, do you know? Arya shook her head. Because there is no task, I can't use the system's navigation, but I just searched for a task for you about this samsara platform. Do you want to accept the task? You didn't even tell me what the task is. How can you let me accept the task? Sorry, sir, I will release the task content to you right away. Refine the samsara platform and reward 3 billion points. At this time, Lin Yu took a breath of cold air after hearing what Arya said. These 3 billion points were simply a huge temptation for Lin Yu. At this time, Lin Yu raised his eyebrows slightly, and then took a deep breath, calming his mood a little.